I guess I'll get started. So thank you, Megan. My name is Tori. I am a Master's of Science student at Memorial University in the Cognitive and Behavioral Ecology program, and I'm presenting my master's research, which is on Leach's Storm-Petrels. So today, the title of my presentation is Exploring and Conserving the Sensory World of Leach's Storm-Petrels. So first, I want to talk a bit about the seabird sensory environment. So seabirds spend nearly their entire lives at sea. They come to land briefly to breed and raise their young, and then they go right back out to sea. So in order to survive that really extreme pelagic environment, they've developed some sensory adaptations, which are pretty cool. So they developed sensory adaptations, visual, olfactory, and auditory adaptations. But today I just want to focus on a couple examples of visual and olfactory adaptations. So some visual adaptations that seabirds have developed. One is that they can forage using oceanic cues. So some birds, for example, terns, they've shown recently adjust their foraging activity based on turbulence. So when there's a really strong flowing current, they'll actually increase their foraging activity because all that buoyant material accumulates in the center of the current and it's easier for them to forage. So they can pick up on that visual cue. Another one is some birds can recognize their eggs based on markings. So for this, common murres can recognize their eggs based on the markings, and they nest really tight groups like shoulder to shoulder with the others, and they have to be able to pick out their eggs. So they've been adapted to be able to recognize their egg based on the markings. And another one is to be able to recognize your mate based on visual cues. So African penguins can actually recognize their mates based on their ventral dot patterns, which is another visual cue they can pick up on. Now we're moving on to olfactory adaptations. So one is that they can locate productive foraging areas. Now I want to preface that this is mainly in tube-nosed birds, so that's of the order Procellariiformes. But these birds use an odor called dimethyl sulfide to navigate the ocean. So this odor is given off by phytoplankton in response to them being predated, so that the birds smell that, they come to that area, and then they eat the prey that are preying on the phytoplankton. So they use this odor to get to those productive foraging areas and then switch to visual cues to actually get their prey. They also use scent for homing. So in this example, Scopoles shearwaters, who were temporarily removed of their sense of smell, actually had a harder time going back to their colony than birds who had their sense of smell intact. So they do use it for homing. And they also navigate downwind to their burrows. So in this case, the pictures of a Leach's storm petrel, and they do use scent, it seems, to navigate to their burrow. If you've ever been on the colony, it is a very dense burrow area, and it's very difficult to be able to find markers with burrows. So I can't imagine finding an unmarked burrow. So while these adaptations are really cool and do help, it's not all good because it does make them vulnerable to sensory traps. So a sensory trap is when an organism responds to a human-produced sensory cue and moves away from natural cues. And this often results in significant negative effects. So, for example, if a bird is flying by and it sees a piece of plastic and it ends up ingesting that plastic. Now, plastic can sometimes mimic prey in scent and also as a visual cue. And so sometimes they ingest that as opposed to going for their typical prey. And this can have negative consequences. Laysan albatross springs to mind. The plastic ingestion for them can be really, really bad. So sensory traps like these for seabirds can be deadly or have just severe negative effects. So one bird that's vulnerable to sensory traps is the Leach's storm-petrel. Um, Megan told me that we love bird pictures here, so I'm going to throw a few at you. This is a Leach's storm-petrel chick. They have been confirmed, they have been told they look like dryer lint. I agree. These are threatened nocturnal seabirds. Here they are as a little bit of a later chick stage. I like to call this their teenage years. They get a funky haircut. And then here they are as a full-fledged chick. So the tube nose is super prominent right here. You can see that. So they do utilize olfaction in many forms that I just touched on. Um, So you guys have storm petrels on your side of the country, but those are the Pacific population. As far as I know, I think they're stable. The Atlantic population is not doing as well. They've declined by 54% in the past 4 decades. And part of the reason for their decline is their vulnerability to sensory traps. And the sensory trap in particular that I'm going to be touching on today is artificial light at night. So, storm petrels exhibit positive phototaxis in that they move towards sources of light. So, if we actually zoom out on this chick picture, this was actually taken at our local mall because the storm petrels were probably attracted to the from the lights of the mall and ended up stranded there. We did put a band on this guy, and hopefully he got a second chance when we released him. But a lot of birds end up stranded around coastal communities where they can't really take off, so they just end up stranded there. And without rescue intervention, they're probably going to end up dying there. So now I want to introduce you to a stranding hotspot in Newfoundland. So here we are in this little square right here. This is a blow up map of Newfoundland, and all of these little red dots represent storm petrel colonies. So there are colonies across the island, but they're mainly focused here on the Avalon Peninsula, which is this little outcrop right here. I'm circling with my cursor. And I want to draw your attention to this big dot right here because this is Baccalieu Island. Baccalieu Island is the world's largest colony of Leach's storm petrels, so it's a very important seabird reserve with about 1.95 million pairs of Leach's storm petrels breeding on this island. And about 9 to 10 kilometers away from this island is this fish plant. So this is a seafood processing plant. As you can see, it's very brightly illuminated at night and it's very big. And this area sees hundreds to thousands of Leach's storm petrels strand annually here. And so we were kind of wondering why they were stranding here. They often actually hit the front of the plant and hit the wall and then fall down and then become stranded. And then they can't make their way back to the ocean. So here's an outline of a bird that has hit the wall. And this is a pretty frequent occurrence in this area. So for my honors research, we wanted to know what role light played in strandings at the seafood processing plant. So we collected stranded birds around the plant in 2021 and 2022. Um, During this time, we were doing morning and night surveys. So in the morning, we would do checks around the plant and pick up any stranded birds we found. When we did the night surveys, we actually stayed up all night and were doing rounds of the fish plant constantly. A lot of the times, stranded birds get predated by cats or foxes. And so we often miss a lot of them in the morning because they've already been predated. So these night surveys allow us to actually get the birds as they're stranding. We also implemented a light schedule to run an experiment on the light. So we had the lights on odd days, and this is represented by the top image here. And then the lights were reduced on even days, and that's represented on the bottom image here. So you can see it's a pretty significant light difference from when the lights were on versus reduced. And this was really successful. We found that there was over a 50% decrease in the strandings of adult birds when the lights were reduced. So this was super successful and did show us that clearly light plays a role in stranding at the seafood processing plant. The knowledge gap that I wanted to explore for my master's is that this is not just some randomly illuminated building. This is a seafood processing plant, and they're processing seafood. And as we know, these guys like to use their olfactory abilities. And so I wanted to know what the role of both the visual and the olfactory cues, both separately and together, had on strandings, and if it played a role at all, or if it was creating a multisensory trap at this stranding hotspot. So that goes into my first part of my experiment where I looked at strandings at the seafood processing plant. So for our methods, here's a better picture of the plant, and you can see just the sheer size of it. So it's the Quinlan Brothers Limited Seafood Processing Plant. And if you're wondering how we did those morning counts, we didn't include the night surveys here. This just includes the morning counts. We actually set up these safe haven boxes. So these are rat traps, to preface, but all the trap part has been taken out. So these just act as refuges for the birds that are stranded. So they will crawl into this little hole and then they're safe from predators. And we can go around and we check these boxes each morning and we pick up the storm petrels that were found in there. So we did this from 2022 to 2024. In 2022, the lighting schedule was still implemented, but in 2023 and 2024, we didn't implement any schedule. It was just the lights were reduced most of the time, except for when people were coming in to unload their catch off the wharf. So to incorporate the olfactory element, we decided that the plant would likely be more odorous when they're actually processing seafood. So we got access to the seafood processing dates. So in Newfoundland, the Atlantic snow crab fishery is huge here. It's fished from early April to late August, and sometimes that varies. And it's processed by boiling. So the plant has these exhaust fans over the crab boilers, which push these fumes outside. And so we thought, is it possible that these odors are attractive to Procellariiformes and could attract Leach's storm-petrels to the fish plant? So our question was, what factors influence the number of stranded Leach's storm-petrels per night? So we looked at a number of factors, including light and scent. We also looked at moon illumination and fog. These guys are known to be storm birds, so they come out when it's foggy, and they avoid bright moonlit nights. This is possibly because of an anti-predator response, but we have noticed this pattern over and over that they seem to not strand as much when the moon is high, but strand more when the moon is low and there is fog. We also looked at factors like wind speed and wind direction to see if wind blowing from the plant towards the colony would pull more storm petrels in because it would be pushing the scent towards them. And then day of year and year just to see if there were any yearly differences. And then to incorporate the interactive effects between light and scent, we included another model which combined these two variables. And I'll show you the results of that in a second. So just looking at the light condition here, we found that the number of stranded birds was less when the lights were reduced. So this effect continued from our previous study where we did find again that the reducing the lights did make a big difference in the number of strandings. This one is more targeting what my whole project was about, looking at the combined effects of light condition and crab processing. So there was no significant difference between when the plant was processing crab or not and the lights were on. However, there was the highest number of strandings when both conditions were present. So the lights were on and the plant was processing crab. So this means that it could possibly be creating a multisensory trap, but we can't say for sure. So strandings were significantly higher when the lights were on, when the wind speeds were high, which is probably because wind speed can sometimes push storm petrels towards or away from the coast, depending on the direction. But when there's really high wind speeds, they have a hard time flying against it. So it makes sense that it's pushing them towards the plant. Lights were on and crab was being processed, which again is that potential multisensory trap. And then in our second model, we also found that strandings were higher in 2024 compared to 2023, but this could just be due to yearly differences in the bird behavior or breeding success, all those things. Strandings were significantly lower when the moon was high, which we predicted, and as the breeding season advanced. And this could be because some of the prospecting birds are leaving, or the chicks are starting to fledge, so the adults are leaving. Could be a number of things that are causing that. Okay, so we've seen what it's like at the stranding hotspot. Now let's dive a little bit deeper and take a closer look at their behavior and how they react to a light and scent cue on the colony. So we studied this on Gull Island, not as big of a colony as Baccalieu, unfortunately, but still a major colony with almost 180,000 pairs. So we recorded birds that approached this platform, as you can see, with a thermal camera. And on this platform, we presented them with one of four treatments. So a scent, which was trimethylamine. I hope you never have to smell this scent. It's burned into my brain. but it smells like rotten fish. So we were trying to emulate some of those odors that were released at the fish plant. And trimethylamine has been associated with crab processing in other areas. So we thought this could be one of the odors leaving the plant. Then we presented them with a light, which was a white LED. Then in combination, the scent and light together, and then a control, which was no condition. And we did this across 31 nights in 2023 and 2024, about equal nights in both years. So here is what the video looks like from the thermal camera. All of those little black dots that you see, a couple more will come up now in a second. There we go. Those are all Storm-Petrels. So this is what the thermal camera was recording. So to analyze this data, we would watch these videos from the thermal camera and just count how many birds we saw in each video. And luckily, because it was a thermal camera, all of our observers were blind to the condition that was being presented, and they were always presented in a randomized order as well. So the results of that revealed that counts of birds were lower when light was presented. So we're seeing kind of the opposite of what we saw at the plant. We're seeing that the birds are actually kind of repelled by the light. And the counts, like I said, were significantly lower than the control and the scent trials when light was presented. They were also lower when the light was presented and the wind direction was blowing from the east. And this could have to do with burrow density. There's not that many burrows towards the west, and the easterly winds would be pushing them towards the coast. Counts were higher when the wind direction was from the north. So same thing, there's a higher burrow density. So when the winds are blowing from the north, it's probably pushing storm petrels from that dense area towards the platform. So like I said, they moved away from the light, which is kind of the opposite of what we predicted they would do. Because they so heavily, we see that positive phototactic response at the fish plant. It was really interesting that when we got to the colony and we were up close and personal, they did the complete opposite. We also found that trimethylamine, or the scent that we used, was not attractive on the colony. So we're kind of seeing two different responses. Off the colony, we're seeing light increasing the strandings, and we're seeing the combination of the light and scent increasing the strandings even further. Whereas on the colony, we're seeing that they're avoiding the light and the scent has no influence. So this was kind of shocking when we first sat down and looked at these results, but then we kind of had to come up with some ideas as to why we thought this response was so different. So some of the hypotheses that we came up with were it could be a difference in behavioral state. So Leach's storm petrels don't forage near their colony. They forage way offshore out by the continental shelf. So it's possible that they're just not in the right foraging mindset. When they're coming towards or away from their colony, they're either going to feed their chick or going back to their burrow and then leaving again to go forage way offshore. So it's possible that they're not associating the scent with foraging because they're not in that behavioral state. It's also possible that the artificial light at night causes disorientation. So, as a scientific community, we've been really hooked on this term light attraction for storm petrels, and it's possible that the light is not actually attracting them, it's just disorienting them. So, when they get to the plant and the lights are on and they're circling the light and they hit that wall and fall down, they're stranding because they became so disoriented and then they hit something and fell. Whereas on the colony, there's nothing for them to hit in this scenario and they're able to avoid it. So they might be disoriented by it, but they're still able to recover from that. They're not getting stranded. It could also be that the odor that we used on the colony was not similar to an odor at the plant. We tried our best to come up with a proxy for the odors. However, we weren't able to actually test what was coming out of those exhaust fans and what was coming out of the crab processing at the plant. I think that would be a really super interesting study for someone else to continue to just see and then compare that to on the colony. But unfortunately, we weren't able to do that. So it's possible they just weren't the same odor and so they weren't attracted to it. And then it's also possible that the light and scent on the colony is just a novel stimulus. So they're just avoiding it because it's new and they're not familiar with it. And of course, it could be a combination of all of these factors. None of these explanations are mutually exclusive, so it's possible that their difference in response was to do with every single one of these factors. So, what to take away from this presentation? How can we move forward with this information? Well, the main thing we can do is to practice light reduction at night. It's good for us, it's good for the birds. It's not just good for seabirds, it's also good for passerines so they don't get disoriented on their migration. For storm petrels, it is pretty crucial. You can clearly see the areas that they strand in are very heavily lit. And unless the winds are in a strange direction where they're all being pushed in, they mainly strand at really well lit areas. So it's clear that for storm petrels, light reduction is a really important step in their conservation. Another step is to shift the sensitive period to early in the year to incorporate adults. So in Newfoundland, the sensitive period for Leach storm petrels is often denoted as the September to November period because that's when the birds are fledging. And fledglings seem to have a different response to the light where it's more extreme and more exaggerated than the adults. The adults seem to be able to, they don't strand as much as the fledglings do. So we often talk about how the storm petrels are sensitive in the fall. However, it's clear that the adults are also stranding all throughout the breeding season at this fish plant and probably at other areas. So I think it's important now that we know that crab processing odors could be um, pushing those strandings even higher. I think we should shift the period to be a little bit earlier to incorporate those adults as well. I also think reducing light exposure on the colony is super important. Now that we know that light exposure is clearly messes with their behavior on the colony, it's important that we don't develop that any further on the colony that we work on Gull and on Bacaloo. There's no lights except for a lighthouse on Bacaloo, but on the Gull Island colony, there's no light. There's no light in the cabin, and it's important that we keep it that way and we keep it dark. But the main thing that we can all take away from this is just to practice light reduction. It's such a small change that can make such a big impact on so many birds. Okay, thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to present. It's really great to present to a different group of people than the Newfoundland crowd. So thank you so much for the opportunity. And yeah, I'll pass it on to Bobby.
Thanks, Tori. Yeah, so I'll just jump right into my presentation. Hold on now. So can you guys see my presentation? Okay, thanks, Tori. Yeah, okay, so my name is Robert Blackmore. You can call me Bobby Blackmore. I'm a research scientist working for Memorial University of Newfoundland, and I work in Bill Montevecchi's lab, the same lab that Tori actually studied in. Um, and so I study fisheries and seabird interactions. Currently, I'm working on a project funded by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and I'm here to talk about that large project today in this presentation. So first of all, you might ask, why does a Newfoundland seabird ecologist work for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service? And the short answer is that following the oil spill that occurred in 2010 in the Gulf of Mexico, the oil companies responsible funded exploration into the adverse effects that this accident had on the environment. And the finding most relevant to those of us in eastern Canada was that our locally breeding seabirds that were overwintering along the coast of the United States were the seabirds most affected by this oil spill, particularly northern gannets, which breed in 6 colonies in North America at the southern extent of their range. And those colonies are found in Quebec as well as in Newfoundland and Labrador. And you can make out on that map that Cape St. Mary's there in green is the southernmost colony for the species. Um, as such, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service decided to research other threats that these marine birds were facing and how their populations might recover following this tragedy. So, in collaboration with Canadian researchers, they funded research into solutions that these birds uh, face both on their wintering and on their breeding grounds. Newfoundland is not only home to half of North America's gannet colonies, but also many other important seabird breeding sites. This figure shows some of the major seabird breeding colonies along the eastern coast of Newfoundland, where many significant numbers of alcids like murres, Atlantic puffins, razorbills breed, as well as black-legged kittiwakes. And this figure doesn't even show the multitude of Leach's storm-petrel colonies around the island. Sorry, Tori. But she showed you guys, and you're familiar with Bacaloo and Gull Island from her presentation. Of note, there are a few breeding sites of small numbers of northern fulmares and Manx shearwaters, but also remember that huge concentrations of sooty and great shearwater overwinter coastally in our waters as well during our summer months. And there are three very important seabird breeding colonies that I want to highlight, not just because of the sheer numbers of birds that breed there at each, but also the biodiversity that each of these sites hold. Um, all three of these sites are positioned near areas with intense fishing activity. And that's not just a coincidence. Many of these seabirds are even in direct competition with prey for our fishing industry. For example, species that forage on Atlantic herring, but we'll get to that species. If I may pull a slide from the BirdLife International Marine Program, which is a fantastic research for seabird ecology and the threats that seabirds face globally. They've identified bycatch in fisheries industries as one of the leading causes of seabird mortality. So, what is bycatch? Well, it's defined as the incidental catch of non-target organisms by fishing gear, and it's a common and difficult to avoid issue across all fishing operations worldwide, pretty much. In Newfoundland, there's a few key types of bycatch that we often see, and those are include undersized target species that get thrown back into the sea because of their small size that prohibits them to be taken in that fishery. Often we see invertebrates, commonly sea sponges, sea stars, crabs, and a myriad of other generally small organisms. There's a lot of other fishes that get caught as bycatch, including nuisance non-target fishes like sculpins or flounders, and sometimes species at risk like wolffish and salmon, and even predatory fishes like sharks and skates, like the one pictured there. And not just fishes, though. Air-breathing marine mammals, or marine animals, sorry, sometimes predators of the target species that are being fished, um, sorry, but often birds that prey upon the same schooling prey of the target species occur as bycatch. Notably, worldwide, there's a concern for megafauna like sea turtles and whales that are frequently seen as bycatch in all kinds of fisheries. However, since we scarcely see whales as bycatch in our inshore Newfoundland fisheries that I'll be discussing today, and that sea turtles generally are quite rare in our waters, I'm just going to focus on seabirds for the purpose of this presentation, and this is a bird-focused presentation anyway. Like this common murre, this is one of four that we recently caught in Atlantic cod gillnet just last month. So bycatch can occur in almost any gear type, and it's usually caused by gears that don't discriminate against the accidental species, which causes their entanglement. Often that's nets like gill nets and long lines. Here's another slide from the BirdLife International program, which shows that longlines and gillnets specifically are the two leading causes of bycatch mortality of seabirds globally. So it's not just a local problem here in Eastern Canada. And that holds true in Newfoundland, where longlines do produce bycatch, but they're not that common of a gear type used. They are used, and I'll touch more on those, but seabird bycatch in Newfoundland is most often produced through gill nets. They're a ubiquitous gear in many inshore fisheries. So gillnets are most often used in these two inshore fisheries, one for catching bait, like herring and mackerel, and that fishery is open to anyone with a shellfish license. So Tori mentioned that the snow crab fishery is a massive fishery. It's a very profitable fishery here in the province, and anyone who wants to participate can place a net in their coastal waters and they can catch some free bait. There's also the commercial Atlantic cod fishery, which is restricted with quotas. And I will clarify, the bait fishery is used to obtain smaller pelagic fishes that are then used as bait in crab and lobster pots. The gill nets themselves are not baited. Herring and mackerel swim near the water's surface during the day, so the nets used in that fishery are only about 6 feet below the surface, and they're called shallow set gill nets. So that's what this figure is demonstrating. Cod, on the other hand, are what's called a demersal fish. They usually swim near the seafloor or just above it. And so the gill nets that are used in that fishery are deep set, often actually touching the ocean bed. And let's see, will these videos, yeah, they will play. Okay. This is a video to demonstrate that gill nets are efficient. They produce catch by ensnaring fish by the gills so that they cannot escape. And you can see that this can also lead to the entanglement of other species. No gulls get caught in this video, but you can see them trying to pilfer the herring from the net, and you can see how it might happen. Let's see. Will that play? Yeah, there we go. Bycatch in the herring fishery usually occurs when the nets are full because the captured herring sit just 6 feet below the surface of the water and they're visible to their predators from above, namely northern gannets. However, just this past June, we had a gannet plunge dive onto one of the herring nets that we were resetting. So this net was almost empty. There were a few fish, so that's this video on the right. There were a few fish that got missed along the way. And this gannet was able to spot one of those lone fish in the net and went for it, only to find itself trapped underwater. And we happened to see this happening, so we were able to go and rescue this bird and thankfully release the bird alive. That doesn't happen very often for this species. Um, yeah, that's enough of that video. Move on. So because herring gillnets are shallow set and they're visible to gannets from above, one of the ideal ways to mitigate bycatch events from happening is by just removing the nets from the water whenever possible, right? And this proved true historically. A moratorium in 1992 on cod fishing in Canada effectively removed hundreds of thousands of gillnets from the water, and birds that were prone to bycatch, so that includes gannets and the alcids in this figure, um, those actually saw population level effects because of the removal of those gear. Whereas surface feeders like gulls, when the fishery shut down, they relied on fisheries discards that were at the surface, and there was actually a decrease in their populations. But apart from closing down the fishery altogether and the usual time-based restrictions with regards to what months the fisheries are open, like seasonally, the next best way to reduce soak time and therefore bycatch risk is to limit the daily soak duration. So this is a study that we performed in 2024, and this figure has got a lot going on, but I'll just run you through it really quickly. So we had control sets where we had herring gill nets that were set in the water for however long the fishermen were going to have them. It was usually exactly 24 hours. Sometimes they didn't get around to hauling their nets for a couple days, so those sometimes were in the water for 48 hours plus. Um, we then altered the soak time. So we had two different versions of that. We had two different 12-hour sets. There was a reduced daytime set where it was set in the morning and hauled in the evening 12 hours later. And there was a reduced night where the opposite. It was set in the evening and it was hauled early in the morning the next morning. And we found that those reduced night sets that were only 12 hours long, they maintained the same target catch compared to the control because the catch of herring happens overnight. When the fish rise to the surface, they have a diel vertical migration in the water column. And so they maintain the same amount of target catch, but there was a reduction in the total bycatch in both reduced sets, both the reduced daytime and nighttime, compared to those 24-hour sets. And in the reduced nighttime sets, there were a lot less birds associating with the vessel. And this has to do with the fact that the birds were more active generally during the day. So when we were setting late in the evening and hauling early in the morning, there were a lot less birds around. So that seemed promising. The kickback from those results, however, is that it's kind of an unreasonable ask in the opinion of many of the fishers, to ask them to do a 12-hour soak time. These fishers in this specific fishery, again, don't profit from the fishery. They do not sell the bait. They only participate to slightly reduce the cost of their bait in an otherwise very expensive to participate in fishery, the shellfish fishery. They would then have to make multiple trips per day. Like we said, go out in the evening, come back in the morning, and they would have to remove and reset their gear every 12 hours. So it turns out that their normal practice of hauling the nets every morning, which they usually went out fairly early in the morning, they actually self-regulated in terms of bycatch and already performed the best practice to reduce those interaction with birds. Go out early in the morning. Don't let the net sit there in the water full of fish during the daytime when those gannets might be foraging in the area. And from a logistics and mandated side of things, the bait fishery is also not really a regulated fishery. There are limited resources available for enforcing any time-based restrictions. So a 12-hour soak time is a great suggestion, but it's pretty unrealistic in practice and applicability. Without getting too into the weeds of the issues, I did want to touch on this because this is a British Columbia audience. I just want to touch on how fisheries are regulated across Canada and give you the BC perspective. We have an incredible density of seabirds on the eastern side of Canada as well as the Pacific. But yet, whenever anyone talks about seabird bycatch globally, often the research that exists out there is a lot of it is on the bycatch of albatrosses in the Pacific Ocean, and for good reason. There's a there's just a lot of research being done out there. It really is a problem. But unfortunately, there's not a lot of research being done on bycatch in Eastern Canada, especially not in Newfoundland. And from a government oversight perspective, seabird bycatch is treated very carefully in BC. Their seabird bycatch is mandatory to report in logbooks that fishers fill out. BC also has a fairly good observer coverage program, so they have a 20% mandatory coverage of inshore fisheries where like seabird observers have to be present on vessels. And those numbers actually often exceed that throughout the province. And those observers are mandated to record and report seabird bycatch. On top of that, you guys in BC, there are cameras deployed on many fishing vessels so that logbooks can be audited. In the Pacific, it seems like the Fisheries and Oceans Canada, DFO, whose mandate is all about fish, invertebrates, and marine mammals, they work in collaboration with the Canadian Wildlife Service, whose mandate includes all migratory birds. And they share a lot of information back and forth so that CWS is aware and involved of everything seabird bycatch related. In comparison, in Newfoundland, nothing has been implemented regarding seabird bycatch. For the bait fishery, logbooks are voluntary with very little oversight. There's no observer coverage in that fishery. In the cod fishery, they have to record catch, but fishermen do not have to self-report anything about seabird bycatch. The observer coverage in Newfoundland is much lower. These last few years, it's sitting at about 5%. And that's it. Those observers are trained to identify and record seabird bycatch, but in both cases, it's not mandatory for them to pass on any information about seabirds to DFO. Even worse, when seabird bycatch is reported in logbooks or in the observer's report, DFO here in Atlantic Canada doesn't compile that information in the same way, and it often doesn't get passed along to other federal agencies like Environment Canada and CWS. So I just wanted to put that out there without getting too much into it, but there are some weird regulations happening in the Newfoundland fisheries, which is why this is really a problem that we need to dig into. Anyway, our herring study was one of very few studies in Atlantic Canada that actually quantify seabird bycatch, and it's one of the only studies to even investigate bycatch in this bait fishery at all. But what about the cod fishery that I mentioned? Here's another photo of one of those murres that was bycaught just recently. Well, cod gillnets are deep set, sometimes many hundreds of feet deep, so shallow divers aren't really able to see or interact with this gear. However, bycatch still occurs, especially with some deeper diving species like common murres. Bycatch is episodic, and when it does strike, it can produce hundreds to thousands of dead birds in a single net, like these examples that I show here. The cod fishery also uses longlines, which are baited. This can attract birds to the bait while the gear is deployed, so thankfully fishers again tend to them often, they tend to often, but not always, set their long lines in the dark. So they essentially don't have to deal with untangling a hooked seabird from their line as they cast it out. Let's see, yeah, this is a little video of them deploying the long line at night. Here's an example of a great shearwater trying to snag some bait off the long line as the fishers haul it in. And there's a video of a northern fulmar actually grabbing the hook and stealing the bait. Well, I don't think he was successful in actually taking it, but you can see how bycatch can happen in that way as well. Mitigation technologies have been tried globally with varied success. Attaching lights on nets in South America greatly reduced sea turtle and cormorant bycatch. High contrast visual deterrent banners were tried in Europe and here in Newfoundland by our research group, along with the lights to test their efficacy, but really to no avail. In that trial, or those trials, sorry, bycatch didn't change while target catch actually went down. So obviously that was not a viable alternative. Looming eye buoys, which are the bottom right figure there, that those are meant to mimic predator eyes, and they were tried in Europe, but there was limited success with those as well. We took it one step further, and we deployed scary bird kites that they hover over the gear and they look like predators. In the pilot studies last year, we trialed peregrine falcons, but they were kind of flimsy, and we ended up opting for bald eagles, which seemed relevant to the locally breeding seabirds as a realistic predator. And so in the spring of 2025, we tested these kites in the herringbait fishery at three sites near the three northern gannet colonies using the normal 24-hour hauling schedule. The kites were attached to high flyers, which are these large poles that are used as buoys, and they were attached directly to the gear you can see in that figure there. Our findings are promising so far, as we found that at all three sites, bird presence near vessels when hauling was reduced when the kites were deployed. This work will continue next year to round out the sample size even further, but I just wanted to share some of these promising results so far. In the cod commercial fishery, just in August and right now in September, a few weeks ago, I was out. We deployed kites on high flyers again with gill nets, but also with long lines. We also deployed the kites from the vessel. This was sort of something we came up with over the course of the summer that because this gear was going out and the high flyer was often very far away from us by the time we were getting to the end of that gear as it was being cast from the back of the boat, it was good to have one on each end. So far, we've only completed 4 trips and they were on the south coast of Newfoundland, but again, these tests are ongoing, including next week. To give you an idea just of how the kites are deployed both on the vessel and the high flyer, here's a couple videos of just what that looks like. You can see him toss the high flyer overboard there. Again, these results are extremely preliminary, but so far there have been less shear waters present during the setting, which remember is at night, and hauling during the day when the kites were up, with the gill nets and long lines. Sorry, the setting of the gill nets was not always at night, but the long lines was. So we are remaining optimistic for these results, and more data is coming in as we speak. So the next steps for us are to continue these trials throughout 2025 and 2026. A student in the Montevecchi lab recently submitted an article where she conducted interviews with fishers across Newfoundland and got their opinions on bycatch and how they might feel about the uptake of bycatch mitigation strategies. So look out for that. And lastly, we're planning to conduct a Seabird bycatch workshop in collaboration with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for early 2026. We plan to have go back. We plan to have conversations with fishers and researchers alike. So if you're a seabird researcher and interested in discussing bycatch, or you have any experience with fisheries bycatch, please feel free to reach out. We'd love to have people from all over North America, in fact. Well, all over the Americas, I'll say. So yeah, I'll just leave you with a little summary and thank you, and we'll get to some questions because I think I'm over 20 minutes. So jump to Megan.
Thank you. That was great. That's an awesome photo too. But you have yourself. Those are those cod?
Yeah, those are some of the biggest I've ever hauled in. Yeah.
Those are huge fish. Those are insane. That's
Yeah.
crazy. I'm just gonna stop recording now so that people can ask